Cities lay in ruins, caravans lay idle, and the copper ships that once stitched 3 continents together were gone, lost to storms, pirates, or the flames that ended the Bronze Age. Egypt withdrew behind its desert walls. The Hittites vanished altogether. Across the Mediterranean, sailors swore the Great Sea had become a graveyard of timbers and dreams. Then, from a narrow strip of rocky coastline, hardly wider than a day's walk, new sails began to dot the horizon. Their hulls carried no soldiers, only cargo. Cedar so straight it became Pharaoh's beams. Jars packed with glass that caught sunlight like frozen water, and a cloth stained royal purple, so costly that kings rationed it by the drop. The crews spoke a tongue most traders had never heard, but they bargained in weights of silver so precise disputes ended before voices rose. They built no empire, minted no grand manifestos, and fielded no conquering armies. Yet within a century, these sailors rebuilt the shattered sea lanes and turned emptiness into opportunity. The Greeks called them Phoenicians, the purple people. We know them as the Phoenicians. We'll follow their cedar ships from the rubble of 1200 BCE to the bustling harbors of Sidon, Tyre, and Carthage. We'll see how they mapped stars long before the Greeks named constellations, how they traded stories and alphabets alongside wine and tin, and how, without ever hoisting a foreign flag, they helped drag the Mediterranean back from the brink of silence. By the end, we'll ask a bigger question. When warlords fail and kingdoms fall, can trade, being daring, and a good map do more to rebuild civilization than any army ever could? Stick with me. The answer rides on a purple-draped sail heading west at dawn. The late Bronze Age ended the way a candle guttered out. One gust and everything went dark. Around 1200 BCE, the Hittite strongholds in Anatolia burned. Mycenaean palaces in Greece collapsed. Egypt warded off invaders, but lost its merchant fleets in the process. For a generation, the sea lanes fell silent. Grain convoys stopped reaching hungry ports. Copper never met tin, and temples from Cyprus to Canaan lacked the incense that once perfumed their halls. Most cities retreated behind walls, hoarded what they had left, and waited for the next raid. Yet along a skinny ribbon of coast, modern Lebanon, and bits of northern Israel, 3 harbor towns held their nerve. Byblos anchored the north, its quays piled with cedar logs that pharaohs had coveted for centuries. Sidon sat in the middle, famous for glass that glowed pale green even under cloud. Tyre, farther south, perched on a twin-island promontory ringed by reefs that broke enemy hulls before they touched the piers. Geography helped. High mountains blocked inland invaders, and the harbors opened straight into deep water, letting ships slip away from shore raiders in minutes. So while inland kingdoms toppled one by one, the Phoenician coast became a kind of refuge, hard to reach, harder to subdue, and blessed with the last working shipyards on the eastern Mediterranean. Survival turned quickly into advantage. Cedar forests in the Lebanon range still stood tall. The Phoenicians felled the trunks, floated them down mountain streams, and hewed them into keels longer and lighter than anything their Mycenaean predecessors had built. They stitched hull planks with flax rope, sealed seams with bitumen from local seeps, and mastered a revolutionary tool: the curved mortise and tenon joint, pegged tight so a hull flexed with waves instead of fighting them. Give a Phoenician carpenter a week and he could shape a 50-foot merchantman strong enough to carry 30 tons of cargo, and nimble enough to outrun pirates who still clung to heavier, older designs. Cargo came next. Egypt, now short of timber and ambition, still craved cedar for palaces and tombs. Assyrian nobles wanted purple cloth, dyed from murex shell secretion so concentrated it took 10,000 snails to color a single cloak. Tiny Byblaean tablets record contracts. 1 log cedar, 20 cubits, for 10 measures silver. 1 amphora wine, Byblos vintage, for 1 ingot tin. Even in chaos, wants remained, and the Phoenicians knew every desire had a coastline. They sailed cedar south to Memphis, returned with gold dust, ferried wine north to Ugarit's ruins, where new squatters paid in grain, and picked up Cypriot copper on the way back. Bit by bit, they restitched a web of exchange others thought unraveled for good. Diplomacy aided them. Unlike sprawling empires, Phoenician cities did not aim to conquer inland. They preferred treaties. Byblos kept its old client ties with Egypt. Tyre sent tribute to whatever regional power looked most dangerous. Assyrians in one century, Babylonians in the next, while still flying its own standards on the docks. Each city was independent enough to negotiate separately, yet close enough to rally ships if one harbor burned. Competition bred innovation. Tyre perfected double-hulled merchantmen. Sidon specialized in blown glass and bulk olive oil. Byblos caught the Egypt trade and funneled silver back north. Losses in one port rarely sank the whole network. On land, they stayed humble. Low defensive walls, narrow streets, temples tucked close to the harbor sheds. But at sea, they projected audacity. Phoenician captains hugged coastlines by day, reading coves as easily as shepherds read clouds, then risked open waters at night, using Polaris to fix latitude, and art Greek sailors would copy generations later. They learned to store fresh water in segmented goatskins that could be moved around for ballast, to pack dates and salted fish in airtight pottery that doubled shelf life, and to barter in weights of silver shaved fine enough to settle arguments on the spot. All this made them magnets for migrants. Displaced craftsmen from Cyprus offered copper-smelting tricks. Greek survivors from Euboea sold iron bars for anchor flukes. Hebrew farmers rode down for day wages on cargo ships when harvests failed. The ports swelled with dialects and trade tongues, but contracts switched to a stripped-down writing system only 22 marks long, the Phoenician alphabet. Anyone could learn it in a week. Carved on cedar tablets or daubed on amphora tags, it turned shipping manifests into pocket-sized records that no longer needed a palace scribe's lifetime of training. Even illiterate deckhands could memorize 3 or 4 letters, enough to spot their name and pay on the wage list. By 1000 BCE, while inland kingdoms still scuffled over broken farmland, Tyre and Sidon launched ventures far beyond the Levant. They planted a trading post on Cyprus, another at Kition, and edged west to set up a safe harbor on Malta. Locals thought them fearless. In truth, they were methodical. Each new anchorage followed the same pattern: a protective mole of stone, a storehouse with its own well, and a shrine to Melkart, the Tyrian sea lord who, legend said, taught humanity how to sail. Their rivals noticed too late. Assyrians taxed them but could not match their fleets. Greek city-states, still rebuilding, envied their purple dye but lacked the shell beds. Piece by piece, the Phoenicians filled the vacuum left by collapse, not with legions but with hulls. And once supply lines reopened, the whole Mediterranean began to stir back to life. Amphorae stamped with Sidonian seals show up in Sardinia. Tin from western Iberia, almost unheard of a century earlier, arrives in Tyre's warehouses. A broken world is knitting itself together, and the needle is a cedar-planked ship under a strip of red-purple cloth. While others fought for land, the Phoenicians fought for the sea, and the sea at last started to give back. The coastline the Phoenicians called home ran barely 120 miles from north to south, about the drive from Baltimore to Philadelphia. Yet their cedar ships would one day circle Africa and nudge into the Atlantic fog. They managed that leap not with armies or colonies first, but by turning everyday cargo runs into floating laboratories. To sail beyond the sight of land, you need more than a sturdy hull. You need food that keeps, water that doesn't spoil, and numbers that make sense when no harbor can bail you out. The Phoenicians cracked each problem in order. They lined wine jars with pine pitch to stop leakage and souring. They packed dates in clay pots filled with melted beeswax, sealing out air. They fitted their holds with cedar planks laid lengthwise so grain could breathe, but rats could not chew through. Every solution became a trade good in itself. Customers down the coast bought the same pitched jars and wax-sealed figs that had arrived in their markets. Next came navigating the open sea. While most sailors clung to shorelines, Phoenician captains trusted a few bright clues in the night sky. They called the North Star the immovable one, not because they knew it sat near Earth's axis, but because they had measured, trip after trip, that it barely budged while the rest of the heavens wheeled around it. By fixing that star just above their stern rail, they could keep a straight course even when clouds buried the horizon. They shared the trick only within crews sworn to secrecy. Foreign traders noticed that Phoenician ships sometimes vanished into open water for days, then reappeared miles down the coast, having shaved a week off the coastal crawl. The shortcut became their edge, and they guarded it fiercely. Cargo paid for these risks, and nothing paid better than purple dye. Along the Levantine shore, tidal pools crawl with murex snails, thumb-sized creatures that secrete a milky fluid when threatened. One drop exposed to sunlight turns first yellow, then green, then a deep violet that sticks to wool like wax to a wick. It takes about 10,000 snails to dye a single cloak, which is why the color became a badge for pharaohs and, later, Roman emperors. The Phoenicians mastered the messy process, cracking shells, fermenting the glands in saltwater vats, and timing the exposure to catch the richest hue. They loaded the finished cloth in cedar chests and sailed it wherever elites had silver. That purple cloak bought more than profit. It bought access. A captain arriving in Egypt with one bale of Tyrian purple earned docking rights and fresh water without paying tax. A governor in Cyprus granted woodcutting permits in exchange for 2 dyed tunics for his daughter's dowries. Even Assyrian kings, known for flaying rebels alive, listed purple cloth from Sidon among tribute they preferred to collect rather than seize by force. The dye was soft power, color that opened gates. Glass was their second marvel. Sidonian workshops discovered that adding natron and manganese to sand produced a clear, faintly aqua glass that could be blown thin as an eggshell. They shaped it into flasks for perfume and lamp globes that burned brighter than clay lamps. Sailors filled the ready-made glass with cedar oil and sold it in Egypt as a luxury scent. Shards of that same hexagonal bottle turn up in Etruscan tombs hundreds of miles away, proof that Phoenician goods traveled further than their hulls, hitching rides on secondary trade loops they had helped reopen. Because they valued cargo space above everything, they redesigned their hulls for volume. A typical Tyrian merchantman stretched about 80 feet with a beam of nearly 20 feet and stood high at the bow so waves broke rather than washed over. Instead of one mast, some carried 2, allowing a second crew to reset sails while the first rested. They invented the crow's nest, a cedar platform lashed halfway up the mainmast, where a lookout, wrapped against wind chill, watched for distant headlands or rival sails. Each innovation shaved time off voyages and increased hull size, which in turn funded better ships. Guarding knowledge became policy. A legend says a Phoenician captain, seeing a rival Greek trireme shadowing him toward precious tin islands, likely Cornwall, ordered his helmsman to beach the ship on a sandbank. His own vessel wrecked, but so did the follower. The captain survived, was reimbursed by Tyrian authorities for the lost cargo, and kept secret the exact route. Whether this story is pure rumor, it rings true. Secrecy was as much a weapon as cedar and sailcloth. By about 900 BCE, Phoenician hulls stitched the Mediterranean into a single market again. Galleys from Byblos carried cedar logs 30 feet long to refurbish Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. Sidonian glass reached Rhodes, where Greek craftsmen copied the style. Tyrian mariners settled a small promontory on the North African coast and called it Quart Hadasht, New City. We know it as Carthage. From there, baby colonies radiated west, Ibiza in the Balearics, Motia in Sicily, coastal outposts in Morocco. Each new port was less an empire garrison and more a franchise. Same purple dye vats, same bitumen caulking, same cedar crossbeams. Their dominance shows up in the strangest places. A cargo manifest scratched on the Uluburun wreck, which sank off Turkey around 1300 BCE, lists Mycenaean goods. A later wreck near Rhodes, dating about 850 BCE, lists half its cargo in Phoenician jars. In a mere 4 centuries, the shipping label for quality had flipped. Even Greek myths nod to the shift. Europa, beloved by Zeus, is kidnapped from a Phoenician shore. Cadmus, city founder, brings the alphabet from Tyre. That may be myth, but it mirrors a truth. Greeks adopted the Phoenician script, tweaked it, and passed it to the world as the first true alphabet with vowels. The sea gave the Phoenicians room to escape invasion and room to innovate, but it also anchored their survival to ships alone. A wildfire in cedar stands, a new alloy making iron more common inland, or a rival power blocking a key strait. Any could tear their web apart. Their own legends speak of storms that smashed fleets and left whole crews begging foreign kings for rights to build anew. Each voyage was both gamble and lifeline. Their ships carried more than cargo, they carried survival itself. When most Bronze Age merchants sealed a deal, they relied on scribes. Need a receipt for 20 cedar logs? A palace clerk pressed dozens of wedge marks into a clay tablet. Want to send a letter to your buyer? Hire a trained specialist who'd spent 10 years memorizing hundreds of cuneiform signs. Egyptian hieroglyphs posed the same hurdle. Only priests and a handful of court officials could read the bird and bolt symbols. Writing was powerful, but locked behind a velvet rope. The Phoenicians cut that rope. Sometime around 1050 BCE, a shipwright in Byblos took a sharp stylus and scratched 22 simple marks on a plank. Straight lines, curves, no flourishes. Each mark stood for a consonant sound in his own language, BGD. Easy to say, easy to spot. No little wedge meant grain taxes, and a bigger wedge, soldiers' rations. Just one sign, one sound. If you could pronounce the word, you could spell it. Vowels? Everyone knew them from speech. No need to write them down. The beauty lay in the math. 22 signs, learnable over a long lunch, replaced the 600 signs of Akkadian cuneiform or the 2,000 of late Egyptian. A deckhand who could tally beam lengths could now jot prices on a potsherd. A trader born in inland Syria could learn the script during the 2-day voyage to Cyprus. The alphabet spread because it was portable, cheap, and, most important, didn't require government schools. Evidence turns up far from the coast. On a limestone shard at Hala Sultan Teka in Cyprus, an apprentice scratched MLK, king, likely doodling while waiting to load copper. At a tiny way station near the Sinai copper mines, someone carved the same letters with a different name into sandstone. That traveler had no palace patron. He had a memory, a knife, and 22 handy signs. The oldest full inscription we know sits on the sarcophagus of King Ahiram of Byblos. The text is short, a curse warning tomb robbers, but it shows the script already locked in. Aleph for glottal stop, Beth for B, Gimel for G down the line. Even its direction, right to left, matches modern Hebrew and Arabic. Those languages didn't just borrow the letters, they inherited them almost wholesale. Hebrew scribes adopted the system by the 10th century BCE. Suddenly, priests in Jerusalem could write prophetic oracles on small pieces of leather. Early biblical fragments, like the silver scrolls from Ketef Hinnom, showed the direct family link, God's name spelled in Phoenician characters, centuries before the familiar block Hebrew script evolved. Greek traders in the Aegean saw the same potential, but wanted full vocal clarity. They kept most Phoenician consonants, flipped their writing direction to left to right, and turned unused consonants, those sounds Greek lacked, into vowels. Aleph became alpha, he became epsilon. Yod turned into iota. With 5 added vowel marks, Greek could note every syllable of Homer's verse. From there, the alphabet marched. Etruscan hilltops, Roman legions, medieval monks, and finally the QWERTY keyboard under your fingertips. Why did the alphabet stick when earlier scripts stagnated? 3 forces converged. First, the sea. On a ship, space is gold, clay tablets break, papyrus rolls absorb a damp. A thin strip of cedar or a shard of pottery with quick stroke-based letters survives spray and knocks. Second, commerce. Every port needed price tags, cargo lists, and IOUs faster than a trained scribe could deliver. The alphabet let traders do paperwork themselves. Third, prestige. For kings, a servant class of literate clerks kept power tight. For Phoenician captains, power grew by giving literacy away. Every new partner who could read a shipping docket became a faster customer. The speed of adoption amazed even ancient observers. Herodotus writes that Cadmus of Tyre brought letters to Greece. That's mythic shorthand for a real, measurable jump. Greek inscriptions appear almost overnight around 775 BCE, with shapes unmistakably Phoenician. Some show up as graffiti at Egyptian tourist sites, Phoenician, Hebrew, and Greek names, etched side by side on statues of Ramses II. Visitors from 3 cultures, each using the same core alphabet, each claiming the right to leave a mark. This democratization came with unintended power. Laws once hidden behind court walls could now be posted in town squares. Poems no longer vanished when an Aoidos died. Scribes could capture them on parchment. Accounts survived storms. If one captain drowned, his duplicate manifest sailed on another ship. The alphabet didn't just record trade, it stabilized it. Guarded trade secrets, star navigation techniques, dye recipes, still passed orally, but the broader system grew harder to control. A runaway apprentice could carry literacy to a rival port. A captive mariner could teach his jailers to keep books. Written knowledge became a stowaway no border guard could catch. By 600 BCE, Phoenician mariners under Pharaoh Necho are said to have circumnavigated Africa, noting the sun rising on the wrong side as they rounded the Cape. Whether every detail holds is debated, but the voyage's log, if it existed, would have been scribbled on waxed cedar tablets in the same 22 characters. The alphabet had become as vital to long runs as spare rope. Yet the script's most lasting legacy would come long after Tyre's walls fell to Babylon. Latin, the language of Roman law, borrowed almost every letter from Greek, then marched them through the empire. Gothic, Anglo-Saxon runes, early Cyrillic, all trace back in strokes and curves to those first Phoenician carvings. Even the modern Arabic abjad, though reshaped for cursive flow, carries the same consonantal backbone. Imagine one Phoenician trader in the 9th century BCE settling under an awning at Carthage and jotting cargo tallies on a strip of bark: wool, wine, silver, cedar. He never meets Greek philosophers, Roman jurists, or English printers. Yet his casual notes carry DNA that Gutenberg will stamp into movable type, and NASA will fire to Mars on a plaque. One trader scribbling on parchment would echo through history louder than kings, and that echo, still ringing in every ABC, sets the stage for our next question. How did Tyre and its far-flung daughter Carthage use those same letters, and the trade they enabled, to challenge empires older and stronger than any Phoenician port. When Tyre's harbor grew crowded with cedar logs and purple-dyed cloth, its ship captains began asking the same question: why sail home empty when the coast beyond the horizon is still wide open? The answer turned into a new kind of empire, one built with cargo manifests, marriage contracts, and cedar planks instead of infantry columns. The venture that best tells the story began, so legend says, with a woman forced to flee her homeland. Alyssa, Greeks would call her Dido, was the high-born sister of Tyre's king. Court intrigue put her life at risk, so she gathered a loyal crew, loaded the city treasury onto cargo ships, and headed west. After hugging Cyprus and slipping past Crete, the flotilla followed a steady North African current until a broad crescent bay came into view. Local Berber chieftains were willing to talk but cautious. Alyssa asked for only as much land as an ox hide could cover, a modest request they granted. She then sliced the hide into hair-thin strips, knotted them end to end, and laid a loop large enough to circle a rocky hill overlooking the water. The trick secured Bursa, the citadel hill of what would become Carthage, and set the tone for every Phoenician colony to follow. Think fast, spend silver wisely, avoid bloodshed when wit can do the job. Carthage was more than clever storytelling. The twin islands off Tyre had taught shipwrights how to build stone moles that calm rough swells, and those same engineers ringed the new bay with quays, dye vats, and freshwater cisterns. North Africa supplied grain in abundance. Its rivers hid seams of silver that Phoenician smelters were quick to tap. Within 2 generations, Carthage was exporting salted fish, olive oil, and Tunisian silver back to the homeland and onto markets as far east as Damascus. The city minted its own silver shekels stamped with a palm tree, both a nod to the word Phoenicia, which sounded like palm to Greek ears, and a brand that soon carried weight from Malta to Gibraltar. Trade bought stone walls, walls protected more trade, and the loop fed itself. Not every outpost needed a queen's dramatic bargain, but each followed a similar blueprint. Head west with a scouting crew, find a harbor with deep water, fresh springs, and native communities open to barter. Lay a small shrine to Melkart, the Tyrian sea god, to bless the deal. Erect a storehouse and a slipway. Then leave behind a handful of families who knew the dye trade inside out. A few years later, the telltale scent of boiling murex shells would drift across the bay. An amphora of bright purple cloth or pitch-lined wine jars would sail east to eager buyers. Phoenicians planted these commercial seedlings like stepping stones. First Malta, then Motia on Sicily's west coast, then Ibiza in the Balearics. Each site specialized: Malta in honey and linen, Motia in dye production when Levantine snail beds grew scarce, Ibiza in salt, and resins used for ship caulking. Gadir, modern Cadiz, anchored their leap into the Atlantic. Established on a sandy Spanish island around 800 BCE, it sat within easy reach of silver and tin coming down from Tartessian rivers. Twin temples to Melkart stood on its docks, their beacon fires bright enough to be spotted 40 miles offshore. Local miners exchanged ore for bronze tools and purple wool. The city's storehouses filled with metal ingots, stamped with a simple anchor symbol, proof that even raw silver now traveled under Phoenician branding. Expansion thrived on blending rather than replacing local societies. Marriage diplomacy was common. A Tyrian merchant might wed the daughter of a Sardinian clan chief, sealing exclusive timber rights in the bargain. Archaeologists uncovered dowry records listing Tyrian glass beads, Cypriot copper bracelets, and North African barley, all woven into the same ceremony. Shrines bear witness to cultural overlap. On Sicily, volcano spirits associated with Mount Etna were quietly paired with Baal, the Phoenician storm god. In Spain, local sun disks appear alongside the stylized conch shell of a stardapp. Rather than impose a single pantheon, colonists mapped their gods onto local ones, smoothing trade negotiations and avoiding religious friction. Secrecy safeguarded profit. Captains sailing beyond the Strait of Gibraltar kept the exact route to the British Tin Islands closely guarded. Greek writers later told of a Phoenician commander who deliberately grounded his vessel when he noticed a rival following too closely. Both ships wrecked, but Tyre reimbursed the captain for his cargo loss. The Greeks got nothing except salt water in their amphorae. Whether exaggerated or not, the tale captures how fiercely the Phoenicians protected the sea lanes that paid their bills. For all its reach, this was not an empire in the Assyrian mold. Each colony retained its own council of elders, struck its own weights and measures, and sent tribute to Tyre only when the balance of power made that wise. Carthage, furthest from Levantine oversight and closest to new resources, evolved into an autonomous city-state almost immediately. By 650 BCE, it was dispatching its own expeditions past Morocco into the Atlantic, filling logbooks with place names where gold dust could be traded for colored glass. Those voyages built a revenue stream so rich that when Assyrian envoys later demanded tribute from Tyre, Tyre quietly diverted payments pulled from Carthaginian coffers. The homeland and its colonies were partners, but also rivals in commercial audacity. This far-flung network rewove the Mediterranean economy. Etruscan princes in central Italy, newly rich from iron, wore Levantine glass beads. Greek potters on Euboea purchased Spanish silver refined in Carthage. Libyan hunters in the Sahara bartered ostrich feathers to Phoenician agents for bronze knives stamped in Tyre. The sea, once a post-collapse wasteland, thrummed like a reopened market square where goods, languages, and ideas crossed paths daily. Such success bred new threats. Assyria's expansion squeezed the Levant. Greek city-states, flush from their own revival, founded new colonies at Syracuse and Massalia, eager to tap the same tin and silver lines. Meanwhile, climate swings in North Africa produced drought years when Carthage's grain exports withered, squeezing revenue and straining supplies at home. The Phoenician heartland, always more vulnerable than its ocean-ringed outposts, would soon face siege towers, tribute demands, and finally the iron-willed armies of Babylon. Yet if Tyre and Sidon were destined to bow under imperial weight, their offspring would not. The West would remember the children of these cedar ship pioneers far longer than it remembered the rocky coves of their birth. The greatest legacy of Phoenicia would no longer be purple cloth or quicksilver trade routes, but a single colony whose name, Carthage, would one day make Rome tremble. When Assyrian envoys first stepped onto the docks of Sidon, they didn't bother to threaten an invasion. They simply pointed north, towards cities already plastered with flayed rebel skins, and unrolled a tariff sheet: grain, silver, cedar, purple cloth, and a levy of trained sailors for the royal fleet. Sidon's elders weighed the cost: pay in cargo now or pay later in blood. They filled the first ship that afternoon. Tribute was not surrender. It was protection money calculated to the last shekel. So began a balancing act that would last 3 centuries. Phoenician ports dancing between superpowers, always one missed shipment away from ruin. Tyre mastered the art. The island city stood a half-mile offshore, ringed by walls rising over 150 feet, sheer down to the waterline. Its merchants agreed to Assyrian tribute, but sent it by sea, sailing north under their own escort, avoiding inland checkpoints where extra taxes might disappear. In return, the Assyrians left Tyre's autonomy mostly intact, content with annual silver and a promise that Tyrian pilots would guide royal ships through reef-lined channels. Eventually, every empire pushes harder. When King Shalmaneser V demanded higher payments and Tyre stalled, Assyria ringed the island with a blockade. Tyrian divers cut anchor cables of enemy ships at night. Archers picked off raft builders by day. For 5 years, the siege dragged on, supply ships slipping past under darkness, till a palace coup in distant Nineveh toppled Shalmaneser and forced his successor to negotiate. Tyre paid a backlog of silver but kept its walls unbreached, proof that tribute could be haggled like any market deal if the city held its nerve. The calculus reset with Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar II had seen Assyria fall and vowed not to repeat its leniency. In 586 BCE, he marched on Tyre with siege towers and engineers who understood island blockades. Tyre's walls again held, but Babylon's navy choked its harbors. After 13 years, the stalemate ended in a treaty. The city handed over royal hostages, heavier tribute, and access to its overseas settlements. Even then, Tyre's traders framed the outcome as expense, not defeat. They reopened their workshops the next morning. Caravans of North African silver and Spanish tin kept the ledgers afloat. Tribute under Persia played out like a subscription service. Cyrus the Great allowed Phoenician cities to govern themselves so long as they paid annually and supplied ships for imperial campaigns. When the Great King assembled his armada against Greece, Tyrian shipwrights built the fastest triremes. Sidonian captains commanded entire Persian squadrons. Somewhere in the fine print, the Phoenicians secured reduced levies on their purple exports to Persian ports, proof that even while serving an empire, they were still making the deal tilt their way. Yet every payment left the coffers lighter, and competing powers always watched. Greek city-states now sailed their own sturdy hulls. Etruscan merchants challenged Phoenician routes in the Tyrrhenian Sea. Inside Tyre's stone quays, families whispered that taxes were rising faster than profits, that Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, each empire looked different but sounded the same when the tribute scrolls unfurled. Worst of all, time eroded what walls could not. Cedar forests thinned from constant felling. Silver veins in Spain ran patchy. The murex beds near Tyre showed signs of overharvest, shells smaller each season. The web of colonies helped. Carthage could send grain during drought years. Malta could ship pitch when Levantine stocks ran dry. But every trans-Mediterranean convoy risked pirates or sudden embargoes imposed by kings far inland, men who thought nothing of cutting the sea lanes if it bled a rival. Survival was not a victory parade. It was a tightrope walk over death. One stiff breeze, one impatient emperor, and the rope could snap. While Tyre counted silver to meet another imperial bill, its distant daughter was growing into something the homeland had never imagined. Carthage began as a safe harbor with dye vats and grain fields, but North Africa's wide plains and steady rains invited bigger dreams. Within a century, the new city's fleet rivaled Tyre's. Within 2, it beat it. Carthaginian captains sailed past Gibraltar to barter for British tin and African gold. They mapped the Atlantic coast, planted outposts on the silver-rich slopes of southern Spain, and hauled home elephants for work and, eventually, war. The culture stayed recognizably Phoenician. Merchants wrote in the same 22 letters, honored Melkart and Astarte in seaside shrines, and boiled murex shells for royal purple that now cloaked Numidian princes and Etruscan chiefs. Yet ambition had shifted. Tyre once paid tribute to survive. Carthage collected tribute to expand. It levied grain from fertile Tunisian valleys, taxed Spanish silver mines, and demanded ship timbers from Sardinia and Corsica. Rather than dodge larger empires, Carthage positioned itself to become one. The city laid out a vast military harbor, an enclosed round basin with docks for 220 war galleys, each slot fitted with a slipway and storeroom. Above every prow hung a carved lion head. Below, craftsmen kept spare oars ready for sudden launch. Commercial piers, separate but adjoining, buzzed day and night unloading saltfish, African ivory, even amber from the Baltic caught through middleman trades. Carthage turned the Phoenician knack for exchange into an engine of statecraft, fueling armies with overseas wealth. Its generals were merchants in armor. Hamilcar led an expedition across the Atlas to buy copper rights, then built frontier forts to hold the route. Hanno sailed south along the African coast, founding stations wherever trade winds allowed safe anchorage. Reports of guerrillas and burning rivers came back with gold dust and spice. Each new venture fattened the treasury and funded a standing fleet that no Levantine port could match. But success bred new rivals. Greek colonies in Sicily felt the pinch first. When they asked mainland allies for help, Athens sent triremes, and a cold trade war turned hot. Carthage answered with hoplites hired from Iberia, Libya, and even Gaul. Battles seesawed across Sicily, temples burned, but the merchant convoys kept sailing, funding the next campaign. Victory remained inconclusive, yet proved Carthage's reach. It was no longer a child of Tyre. It was its own colossal power. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome looked west and saw Carthage's anchor seals on every amphora of Spanish wine and African olive oil landing in Italian markets. The Senate's ledgers tallied lost tariffs, and its admirals counted enemy hulls. Port by port, island by island, the two republics drifted toward collision. The old Phoenician strategy, blend, bargain, sidestep, met a state that wanted more than trade advantages. Rome wanted exclusive control. Carthage responded with the family model it knew best: contract allies, hire experts, leverage wealth. A general named Hamilcar Barca trained his young son Hannibal to hate Roman power. The boy took the lesson across the Alps with war elephants, shocking the world and nearly toppling the Republic. Even when Rome finally razed Carthage to ash, legends say the conquerors went silent at the sight of the harbor's engineering, proof that a merchant culture could shape arms mighty enough to shake an empire founded by soldiers. Tyre had taught its children to read the stars, to stitch planks tight, to sell clever solutions instead of swinging swords. Carthage took those lessons and added one more. Wealth can build a navy strong enough to fight any tyranny that threatens the sea lanes. They built a world Rome would one day fear. The loudest names of antiquity, Assyria, Babylon, Rome, left walls, laws, and battle dates we recite in school. The Phoenicians left subtler marks, yet you meet them every time you read a street sign, swipe a credit card, or watch a cargo ship slide beneath a bridge. Their victories were quiet, but they outlasted the trumpet blasts of conquering armies. Start with the letters. Aleph once meant an ox's head, Beth a house. A Tyrian trader scratched those shapes on a cedar tablet so crewmen could tally cargo without hiring a palace scribe. Greek sailors borrowed the set, turned unused consonants into vowels, and passed it on. Latin carved it in stone, monks inked it on parchment, printers pressed it into movable type, and programmers assigned each symbol a digital code. 22 lean characters widened into every A through Z that headlines and love letters still depend on. When phones ping with a 3-word text, they echo that first scratch of stylus on wood. The same principle, strip complexity, boost access, guided Phoenician trade. Where earlier kingdoms stamped clay suits of armor onto every transaction, Phoenician contracts traveled on palm-sized parchment. They set standard weights of silver that could be checked with a pocket scale, letting strangers close deals before sunset. Today's shipping containers work on the same logic: uniform sizes, universal seals, fewer translation points. Modern ports move 20-foot boxes under the cranes that Tyrian engineers would have admired for their ruthless efficiency. The route from Shanghai to Los Angeles traces a mindset first tested when a Sidonian skipper shaved days off a journey by steering into open water guided only by the North Star. Even maritime law carries Phoenician fingerprints. In their merchant courts, a captain owed full restitution for cargo jettisoned in a storm if he saved the vessel and crew. Early evidence of general average, the principle that ship, owners, and cargo share losses. Medieval Mediterranean codes adopted the same rule. Today, it lives in the York-Antwerp rules that govern international shipping disputes. When insurers debate who pays for containers lost in rough seas, they argue inside a framework drafted, in spirit, on the quays of Tyre. Look closer, and their DNA appears in objects we hardly notice. The color purple, once rare enough to cost a laborer's yearly wage, became cheaper only after other chemists reverse-engineered the snail dye secret the Phoenicians had guarded. Their methods pushed later artisans to explore plants, minerals, and eventually coal tar until synthetic violet filled factories. Glass windows descend from Sidonian workshops that learned to blow sand and natron into transparent panes. Medieval glaziers tweaked formulas, but the breakthrough, heat, air, twist, was already old when Rome rose. Their diaspora seeded more than goods. Phoenician sailors hired local crews wherever they docked, and DNA studies of coastal communities from Sardinia to Tunisia show Levantine markers woven into modern genomes. The same is true linguistically. Spanish mariners in Cadiz still call certain fishing nets alfarjes, a word traced back to Punic loanterms. Maltese boat builders paint the Eye of Horus on prows, a tradition scholars believe sailed west from Byblos 2.5 millennia ago. The greatest echo may be psychological, a conviction that distance is a problem solvable by ingenuity. Long before Vasco da Gama or Magellan, Phoenician captains rounded Cape Bojador, charted prevailing winds, and returned to tell the tale. Herodotus records, half disbelieving, that they circled Africa and saw the sun on the wrong side of the sky. Whether every detail holds is less important than the mindset it records. The Earth invites mapping, not fearing. Modern GPS satellites and deep-sea fiber cables continue that lineage, shrinking oceans to pathways. In the end, the homeland fell. Tyre's walls cracked under Babylon's hammer. Sidon burned under Darius, and Carthage turned to salt under Roman grief. Yet the ideas they floated, alphabet, open trade, contractual fairness, maritime daring, sailed on. They slipped past sieges the way their captains once slipped blockades, tucked into the holds of other cultures, ready to be unpacked wherever seekers saw value. You don't need an empire to change the future. You just need an idea carried by the waves. The Phoenicians launched theirs on cedar planks, and those planks have drifted, unseen but solid, beneath human progress ever since. Walk the Phoenician coast today, and you won't find soaring temples or marble generals. The sea has eaten the cedar piers, and apartment blocks cover most of the old harbors. Yet every time you open a novel, type an email, or watch a container ship slide towards sunset, you trace their outline. 22 brisk letters let us spell anything from love to law. Standard weights of silver grew into the global banking rules that wire money in seconds. The lighthouse beacons they raised on island keys glow again in blinking harbor lights from Los Angeles to Singapore. No statues needed, they engraved their memory in habits we now call ordinary life. Their genius was humble. Make tools simple, share them widely, and let exchange do the rest. Out of a rocky strip smaller than New Jersey, they rebuilt a shattered sea, taught strangers to read each other's prices, and bridged cultures that once traded only spear points. When empires rolled in with tribute scrolls and siege towers, the Phoenicians paid, paused, then sailed around the problem. When their homeland finally fell, their ideas kept moving, lashed to Carthaginian hulls, stamped on Greek coins, wearing Roman togas, traveling in missionary script across Europe and, centuries later, across oceans. That is why their story matters. It reminds us that influence need not ride on conquest or columns of smoke. A single clever workaround, a lighter alphabet, a tighter joint between whole planks, can ripple farther than any victory parade. Quiet solutions survive loud disasters. They outlast walls and kings. If that thought speaks to you, if you feel the tug of builders whose names faded but whose work still anchors our world, stay aboard. Click subscribe and join me as we sail on to the next forgotten shore. There are more echoes waiting in the waves, and together we can bring them back to light.